I've chosen to print out my outline like you do it in a real exam, and I've also chosen to do my presentation about the adventure of the Sussex vampire. I'm gonna come in on some different elements of the story. Whereas I want to start by saying why I chose the story, the introduction to it, plot and short outline of the story, the settings, the characters, the title of the story, and how would you make it modernized in today's society. I chose the story, the adventure of the Sussex vampire, because I liked how it was built up, how Holmes throughout the story figured out who the culprit was, and how he used his intellectual deduction to do so. Yes, the Adventure of the Sussex Vampire was published in 1924 by the author Conan Doyle, and is one of the 12 stories in the cycle, the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes. The story uh, is about how Sherlock Holmes receives two letters from a man called Mr. Ferguson, whereas he describes how he thinks his wife has become an vampire because of because he's seen how the wife sucks blood from their baby's from their baby's neck. Um, Therefore, he writes to Mr. Holmes to get his help and see what he can do and figure out the crime behind why the mother is sucking blood from their baby son's neck. The reason Holmes takes the case is because the two letters take his interest. When he sees the word vampire, he gets intrigued by what's going on, and this is also where you already see the supernatural element of the story, exactly vampires. To sum up the resume, I think there's like four major steps in the story that builds up to the climax, where there's like no point of return. The first step is when Holmes receives the two letters. This is where it shows all the supernatural, like I just pointed out, and also has references to vampires, and this is the reason it catches Holmes' interest. The second step is when Mr. Ferguson becomes convinced that his wife is sucking their baby son's blood, and therefore locks her in their room because he's convinced that she's a vampire. The third step is when their nurse has seen when their nurse sees the wife suck blood from the baby's neck, and tells Ferguson, but he refuses to believe it, even though he actually is convinced of what's going on. The fourth step is when the blood from the child's neck appears on the wife's lips. This is where she gets caught in the deed, and there's no point of return for the wife, and that therefore I think this is the climax, and this is why Mr. Ferguson 100% gets convinced that she's doing it. The setting in general throughout the story is throughout the evening, and it's very foggy. This also shows how the element of this also shows the element from the horror genre, which makes sense since it's the story of the super since it's a story where it has supernatural elements. For example, the letter about the vampire. The characters I've chosen to take the four characters: Holmes, Dr. Watson, Mr. Ferguson, and Mr. Manson, because I think these are the four most impactful characters in the whole story. Being Holmes, he's of course the detective. Watson for being Holmes's brightest assistant. Mrs. Ferguson for making her husband believe that she's actually a vampire, and Mrs. Manson, the maid that tells Mr. Ferguson what's going on. In general, throughout the story, I think Holmes, when looking at a crime scene, he approaches it with his intellectual deduction, where he's able to not give us, the reader, a clue, or making us not being able to figure it out on our own. He just comes with the observations at the crime scene due to his great mind and intelligence he has, and that therefore is the reason that he can solve the crime. Dr. Watson is because he's being the assistant to Holmes. Uh, he's a former army doctor, so he can analyze the body in another way than Holmes does, since Holmes uses his mind and Dr. Watson uses more, it's more hand to hand job, if you could say it like that. Mrs. Ferguson, the second wife, that's the whole story surrounding her. Because if she wasn't in the story, there would be no vampire aspect to it at all or anything, and that's why I've chosen also to take her with me in the story, of course, and Mrs. Manson because she's the loyal servant to Mr. Ferguson, who tells Mr. Ferguson what's actually going on, and that's the whole reason uh, for the letters to Mr. Holmes and everything. That makes the story clear. Um, the title of the story, when we read the story, we notice how there's like two subjects, themes. You get a side insight to. This is gender on the one side and vampire on the other. Of course, vamp. Of course, gender. When we see how it's the woman in in the past society, that's the vampire, and the man that's like the logical one. This is because like there's been this Victorian age where women are either the ladies in the society, if you could say it like that, that has everything under control and is very loyal to the husband and greets people nicely and so on, or you have the other ones on the other side, the other women's that are very what can you say, crazy and uh, orthodox in the way that they handle things. Um, when looking at the vampire aspect, it gets showcased how it's a woman instead of a man. And in today's society, if we want to drag it up to a reference, you can see in the Vampire Diaries how these two roles have changed. And today it's men that are the vampires, and now women are the ones not being the vampires. This shows that the society throughout the decades has become more and more equal with men and women in general. Um, the story could be modernized by using emails instead of letters, and also another major part I think that's important for me is not making it so easy for Dr. Holmes, Sherlock Holmes, to figure out who the culprit is. Like, all he had to do was look at the dog. He figured out the poison, and therefore he figured out it was the older sons who was blowing poisonous darts at his younger brother in the neck. Like, make it harder for him, like we've seen in the series Sherlock in Class. Make it a lot harder for him to come to the final stage of finding a culprit instead of just giving him the clues on a platter right in front of him. Thank you. That was my presentation.